For 200 years, a growth on a tree at the university kept it secret, and no one dared to touch it. Until one professor made the first cut. What was found inside shocked the entire campus. Subscribe and write where you're watching this video from. The university courtyard lay still in the pale light of an autumn morning, its red brick buildings lined with ivy that had begun to bronze and curl at the edges. High Gothic towers, with their pointed spires and narrow, arched windows, framed the view like silent sentinels, their shadows stretching long across the cobbled paths. The scent of old wood and worn stone mingled in the cool air, a quiet reminder that this place had stood for generations, weathering storms and wars, revolutions and renaissances of thought. Students moved between lectures, their voices hushed as if instinctively aware that the very walls listened. And in the center of the main quadrangle, where all paths seemed to converge, rose the great plane tree. It was not merely a tree, nor was it treated as one. Its massive trunk, easily the breadth of 3 men standing shoulder to shoulder, bore the mark of centuries in the deep fissures of its bark. But what drew every eye, from the most jaded graduate to the newest wide-eyed freshman, was the bulging mass protruding from its side, nearly at the height of a man's chest. It was an immense, rounded swelling in the wood, so pronounced that it altered the silhouette of the entire tree. The surface of the bulge was a network of ridges and creases, its coloration a shade darker than the rest of the bark, as if the tree itself had wrapped its body around something hidden and never let go. Over the years, countless stories had grown around that peculiar shape. Some claimed that in the tree's earliest years, a mischievous student had buried a chest of gold inside it, which the plane tree had greedily swallowed. Others swore that a time capsule lay within, letters, photographs, or perhaps a single groundbreaking invention concealed by forward-thinking professors. There were even those who spoke of bones, the remains of a man who had died under mysterious circumstances in the early 19th century, when the university was a different world altogether. The stories had no evidence, but they did not need it. A legend's power was in its telling, and this legend had been told for over 180 years. Few people cared to examine the tree beyond the charm of the tale. But for Professor Aaron Blake, the bulge was more than a curiosity. It was a clue. Blake was a man who moved through the campus as though it were an extension of himself, his figure instantly recognizable even from afar. Tall and lean, his dark skin carried the soft sheen of age, and his beard, neatly kept, silver at the chin, framed a face of quiet authority. He dressed with an almost anachronistic precision, a tweed jacket with leather elbow patches, a vest beneath it, a silk tie knotted just so. His cane, tipped with polished brass, clicked rhythmically on the paving stones as he walked, though his stride was as steady and strong as any man 20 years younger. The cane, like much about him, was part of a deliberate image, one that suited his role as head of the Department of History of Science. Blake had spent decades studying the turning points of human knowledge, moments when ideas had been discovered, suppressed, forgotten, and rediscovered again. In his view, history was not a neat progression, but a fractured mirror, full of shards that could cut the fingers of anyone who reached without care. The university itself, with its endless vaults and archives, had been his hunting ground for more than 30 years. And it was in one of these archives, on a rain-slick afternoon a decade ago, that he first encountered a reference to something called the vessel entrusted to the hands of nature. The wording struck him then as almost poetic, but further digging revealed it to be part of a cryptic memorandum written by a rector in the early 1800s. At first, Blake had dismissed it as the kind of flowery nonsense academics of that era often indulged in, but the phrase returned to him again and again. Entrusted to the hands of nature. What could that mean, except that something had been deliberately hidden in a living thing, perhaps in the earth or in a tree? When he learned that the university's plane tree had been planted precisely in that period, a thought began to take root. It was nothing more than a notion at first, something he turned over idly in his mind. But the more he studied the university's history, the more convinced he became that the bulge on the plane tree was no accident of growth. He had pieced together scraps over years, combing through dusty ledgers and fragile yellowed correspondence. There were hints of a group of professors, natural philosophers, engineers, and physicians who had grown dissatisfied with the restrictions of the day. In that era, certain ideas could ruin a man's career or bring the wrath of the church upon him. Radical theories of medicine, early designs for machines that hinted at automation, and studies of electricity that seemed almost magical. All could be deemed dangerous, even heretical. These professors, according to the fragments Blake found, had sworn to preserve their work until a time when the world was ready for it. The vessel was said to hold the fruits of their labor, but no record existed of where it was hidden, only that it was placed where neither man nor flame nor the fury of the storm might touch it. The professor was careful never to share too much of his theory with colleagues. Academia had little patience for wild conjecture, and though Blake's reputation was solid, he knew that being labeled a romantic would do him no favors. Still, each time he passed the tree, he would slow his pace and study the bulge, imagining the hollow space within, the shape of a sealed container pressed against the inside of the living wood. Over decades, the plane tree had grown enormous, its roots pushing up the paving stones, its limbs stretching toward the sky as if drawing power from the very air. If something had been placed inside it when it was young, by now it would be completely engulfed, encased in living tissue. On days when his lectures ended early, Blake would sometimes linger in the courtyard, watching how the sunlight touched the bark, or how students, unaware of his gaze, would pause to run a hand over the swelling as though trying to feel a heartbeat. He thought of it as a silent guardian, a creature that had taken a secret into itself and vowed to keep it until the right moment came. He wondered if he would live to see that moment, or if the mystery would outlast him, as it had outlasted so many others. That autumn, a change came. A series of storms swept through the region, bringing fierce winds and heavy rain that stripped the plane tree of half its leaves. Blake, returning from a conference in another city, found the courtyard littered with branches, some as thick as his arm. Maintenance crews had cordoned off the area, and as he spoke to one of them, a young man in a neon vest, he learned that the bulge had shown signs of strain. Deep cracks had appeared along its base, and in one storm, the entire mass had swayed dangerously. If it were to break free, it could fall onto the main path or even into the doorway of the science faculty building. The news tightened something in Blake's chest. If the bulge was indeed what he thought it was, this could mean exposure or destruction. The university had not yet decided what to do, but the risk was clear. The tree had stood for nearly 2 centuries, yet time and weather had a way of forcing even the strongest guardians to yield. That night, in the quiet of his book-lined office, Blake sat at his desk with the old memorandum spread before him, reading the words for the 1,000th time, entrusted to the hands of nature. He thought of the storm, of the split bark, of the danger to the tree and to whatever lay within. The professor knew one thing with certainty. If the plane tree's secret was ever to be revealed, it would have to be soon. And if anyone was to protect it from greed or ignorance, it would have to be him. He leaned back in his chair, the tick of the old wall clock loud in the silence, and decided that he would attend the next meeting of the university's grounds committee. The legend of the plane tree was about to face its first real test in generations, and Aaron Blake intended to be there when it happened. The days following the storm were restless ones for Professor Blake. Though the courtyard had been cleared and the university's maintenance crews had stabilized the area around the plane tree with temporary supports, the image of those deep cracks in the bulge refused to leave his mind. He could picture them too clearly, jagged openings in the bark like warning signs from the past, urging him to act before time or nature took the matter out of his hands entirely. It was not only a sense of preservation that drove him, but the gnawing conviction that something extraordinary lay hidden there, something tied directly to the whispers he had been chasing through archives for decades. He returned to the university's library more often now, sometimes in the early morning before the first students arrived, sometimes in the dim quiet just before closing, when the tall windows turned black with night and the lamps cast golden halos over the reading tables. The archivist, long accustomed to his presence, would nod politely and leave him to his own devices. They had seen him disappear into aisles of century-old ledgers bound in cracked leather, their pages smelling faintly of dust and ink. This time, however, his search was not for general knowledge, but for specific names, specific phrases that had haunted his thoughts ever since he first read that memorandum. The trail was faint, consisting not of a single clear narrative but scattered fragments, each hidden within unrelated documents as though their authors had deliberately avoided recording the full truth in one place. In a letter dated March 1840, he found a passing reference to our pact, sworn beneath the autumn moon, that knowledge may sleep undisturbed until it is safe. The letter was unsigned, addressed only to my esteemed colleague, and filed among mundane correspondence about lecture schedules and textbook orders. Elsewhere, in a worn notebook belonging to a long-dead professor of natural philosophy, there was a sketch of a cylindrical object, its dimensions neatly annotated, alongside diagrams of gearwork far too sophisticated for its time. Beneath it, in a hurried scrawl, someone had written, "To remain where the flame cannot reach, where the storm cannot scatter." The more he uncovered, the more Blake began to see a pattern. These were not isolated eccentricities, but pieces of a larger puzzle, the outlines of a secret society within the university itself. In those years, the early industrial age was in full swing, and new inventions seemed to emerge every season. Steam engines, telegraphs, rudimentary electric devices, but not all inventions were welcomed. Some were suppressed out of fear, others stolen and claimed by opportunists, and there were ideas so far ahead of their time that even their creators feared what might happen if they were misused. The professors behind this hidden vessel, Blake suspected, were such men, visionaries who understood both the promise and the danger of their work. One rainy afternoon, seated at a long oak table beneath the domed reading room, Blake unfolded a set of campus maps from 1835. He traced the outlines of the original buildings, noting how the central courtyard had been arranged differently then, the plane tree just a sapling at the edge of what was then an open field. There was no mention of it in the landscape and notes, yet on the reverse side of one page he found a tiny ink blot shaped uncannily like the same swelling he had seen all his life. It was absurd to think it intentional, but the coincidence made his pulse quicken. That night, at home, he pulled from his shelf the first memorandum that had sparked his obsession. He had read it so many times he could recite it from memory, yet still he laid it out beneath the desk lamp, running his fingers over the faded ink. The phrasing was deliberate, almost ceremonial. It is entrusted to the hands of nature that she might guard what man cannot without danger. The wording suggested a conscious decision to place the vessel somewhere only a living thing could protect. He imagined the scene: men in dark coats and hats standing beneath the young plane tree, digging into the soil, placing a sealed bronze cylinder against its trunk, and binding it there before covering it over. Then, over decades, the tree's flesh would have grown around it, swallowing it whole until the secret was hidden in plain sight. He tried to share none of these thoughts with his colleagues. The younger academics were too steeped in the measurable and the verifiable to entertain a hypothesis built on little more than circumstantial evidence and instinct. Once, over coffee in the faculty lounge, he hinted to a fellow historian about his suspicion that an artifact of great importance might be concealed somewhere on the grounds. The man chuckled, shaking his head, and said, "Aaron, you've been reading too many adventure novels. Trees don't keep secrets, people do." Blake had smiled in response, but inside he felt the familiar tightening in his chest, the mix of frustration and resolve. It was precisely because people failed to look that the truth so often remained hidden. As the days passed, he became more aware of time pressing against him. The storms that autumn had been fierce, and weather reports suggested more were on the way. If the bulge split open on its own, whatever lay inside could be destroyed or damaged beyond repair. Worse, if it were revealed without preparation, it could fall into the wrong hands: curiosity seekers, collectors, or those who saw only profit in the past. That thought disturbed him more than anything. In quiet moments, he found himself imagining the professors of the 19th century, their minds alight with ideas that the world was not yet ready for. He saw them in candlelit rooms, drafting equations and diagrams, speaking in hushed voices about machines that could harness forces barely understood. He imagined their debates about how to keep their work safe, how to ensure it would survive them without being corrupted. And he imagined the pact they must have made, binding them not only to each other but to the generations who would follow, if they could find the vessel and understand its purpose. One evening, in the dim glow of his desk lamp, Blake noticed something he had overlooked before. In one of the old letters he had collected, the writer mentioned the bell of the tree as a metaphor for silence. It struck him suddenly that perhaps it was not a metaphor at all. Bells, cylinders, vessels, these were shapes that repeated themselves in the accounts, each time in slightly different language. Perhaps the vessel was not a chest or a box, but something cylindrical, metallic, designed to last centuries without succumbing to rot or rust. The bronze cylinder in the sketch he had found seemed to confirm it. As these thoughts circled in his mind, Blake felt the narrative of the past beginning to sharpen. What had once been a collection of disjointed fragments was coalescing into a story with direction, motive, and intent. And at the center of it stood the plane tree, a living monument to a promise made long before his time. The professor knew he was close, closer than he had ever been, yet the question remained: how to bridge the gap between knowledge and action. He could not simply demand the tree be cut open based on his suspicions alone. But fate, it seemed, was already moving in that direction. Word reached him that the university's grounds committee had scheduled a meeting to discuss the risks posed by the bulge and whether drastic measures would be necessary to prevent it from falling. Blake closed the last of his books that night with the sensation of a man standing on the threshold of something immense. The shadows of the past were lengthening toward him, and he felt the weight of their attention. Soon, the decisions of others would force his hand, and when that happened, he intended to be ready, not merely as an observer, but as the one who understood what was at stake when the heart of the plane tree was finally revealed. The meeting of the university's grounds committee was scheduled for a Thursday afternoon, in one of the smaller wood-paneled conference rooms overlooking the main quadrangle. Professor Blake arrived early, his cane tapping lightly on the polished floor as he crossed the hallway. Through the tall windows, he could see the plane tree standing in its usual quiet majesty, the late autumn sun casting long shadows over the courtyard. The bulge, even from this distance, seemed more prominent than ever, as if it had swelled further in defiance of the season. He took his seat at the long table and arranged his papers before him, though, in truth, he did not expect to refer to them. His arguments were not on the pages, but in his mind, distilled from years of careful observation and research. Members of the committee filed in gradually, administrators in tailored suits, faculty representatives, a pair of groundskeepers in work shirts, and even a visiting arborist whose expertise was meant to guide the decision. Their conversations were hushed but purposeful, the kind of subdued tone that meant the outcome would carry weight. Blake listened without joining in at first, preferring to measure the mood. It was clear from the outset that the bulge had become more than a curiosity. It was now officially a problem. Reports from maintenance detailed how the latest storm had deepened the fissures along its base, and wind had caused the upper limbs of the tree to sway in ways that placed stress on the trunk. One particularly vivid photograph showed a strip of bark peeled back to reveal the pale, living wood beneath, a wound that seemed to confirm the tree's vulnerability. When the chair of the committee, a pragmatic vice-chancellor with a clipped manner, opened the floor for discussion, opinions diverged quickly. The arborist, a lean man in his 40s with weathered hands, explained that while the plane tree was generally healthy, the unusual growth created an uneven distribution of weight. In high winds, that imbalance could cause the bulge to shear off, taking part of the trunk with it. The safest course, he argued, would be to remove the growth entirely, possibly even excising a portion of the trunk to ensure the tree's stability. The groundskeepers nodded gravely at this, noting the heavy pedestrian traffic in the courtyard and the potential danger should the bulge collapse unexpectedly. Yet there were others, particularly from the Faculty of Environmental Sciences, who balked at the idea of any cutting. They spoke of the tree's role in the ecosystem, its importance as a historic landmark, and the symbolic value it held for the university community. One professor, her voice tinged with emotion, declared that altering the tree would be like slicing open a cathedral wall to straighten it, an act of sacrilege against living history. The debate grew sharper, voices tightening as practical safety concerns clashed with preservationist ideals. Blake listened for some time before leaning forward, his hands resting lightly on the table. When he spoke, his voice was calm but carried the weight of authority that came from decades of scholarship. He acknowledged the legitimacy of both sides, the undeniable risk posed by the bulge and the irreplaceable heritage of the tree, but then he shifted the discussion. There was, he suggested, a third consideration, one that had not been given due attention, the possibility that the bulge concealed something of historical significance. His words drew a ripple of reaction around the table, some eyebrows lifting in interest, others in skepticism. He did not speak of legends or romantic notions. Instead, he referred to documented patterns in the university's past, instances where artifacts and manuscripts had been hidden to protect them from political or social upheaval. He explained, with careful restraint, that in the course of his research he had encountered multiple references to an object, likely cylindrical, possibly metallic, that had been entrusted to the hands of nature in the early 19th century. While he stopped short of naming the plane tree outright as the vessel's hiding place, the implication was clear enough. If the bulge did indeed contain such an object, then cutting into it without proper preparation could risk damaging or losing it forever. For a moment, the room was silent, the weight of his suggestion hanging in the air. The vice-chancellor, to her credit, did not dismiss the notion outright. She asked him what exactly he proposed. Blake outlined a plan. A controlled, supervised examination of the bulge, conducted with the assistance of both arborists and conservation specialists. The aim would be to determine whether there was in fact any foreign object inside, and, if so, to extract it without harm to either the tree or the contents. The process would be documented thoroughly, and if nothing of significance was found, the necessary trimming could proceed as originally advised. The proposal seemed to bridge the gap between opposing sides. The preservationists appreciated that the tree would be treated with care and expertise, while those concerned with safety saw that it would still be addressed in a timely manner. After further discussion, the committee voted to proceed with Blake's plan. It was agreed that the examination would take place within a week, weather permitting. A small team would be assembled, including the arborist, a pair of skilled tree surgeons, a conservator from the University Museum, and an assistant from the Department of History of Science. Leaving the meeting, Blake felt the rare satisfaction of having steered a decision without forcing it. The agreement meant more than just an opportunity to test his theory. It meant he would have a sanctioned, legitimate reason to examine the heart of the bulge. He had no illusions about what might follow if his suspicions were correct. The moment any artifact was found, there would be a surge of interest from administrators, historians, perhaps even the media. But at least he would be there at the moment of discovery, able to ensure the object's safety before others could lay claim to it. The days leading up to the examination passed with a mixture of anticipation and unease. Blake prepared meticulously, reviewing the old documents once more and making notes of the specific dimensions and features described in the 19th century sketches. He also walked past the plane tree each morning, observing it in different lights: pale dawn, bright midday, the amber glow of dusk, searching for any change in the bulge's surface. It remained steadfast, a silent guardian of its own secret. Students crossed the courtyard without a second thought, their chatter rising and falling in the crisp air, unaware that within days a centuries-old mystery might be brought into the light. On the evening before the appointed day, Blake returned to his office after a lecture to find the campus unusually still. A light fog had rolled in, softening the edges of the buildings and muffling the sound of footsteps. He stood for a moment at his window, gazing across the quadrangle towards the shadowed mass of the plane tree. Even from this distance, the bulge seemed to draw his attention, as if it were aware of the scrutiny it was about to face. He wondered briefly if those who had hidden the object inside had ever imagined this moment, or if they had believed their secret would remain untouched forever. As he locked his office and prepared to leave, Blake felt the pull of history pressing against the present, an almost tangible weight in the cool night air. Tomorrow, the first cut would be made, not in reckless haste, but with deliberate care. And with it, the truth of the plane tree, whatever it might be, would begin to emerge from the living wood where it had slept for nearly 200 years. Morning broke over the campus with an almost unnatural clarity, as though the sky itself had been scrubbed clean overnight. A thin frost clung to the cobblestones of the quadrangle, shimmering under the pale winter sun. The air was crisp enough to make each breath visible, and the bare branches of the trees stood etched against the sky like delicate ink drawings. At the center of it all, the plane tree waited, its massive trunk casting a long shadow that stretched nearly to the steps of the science faculty building. The bulge protruded from its side like a silent, expectant witness to the events about to unfold. Professor Blake arrived before most others, his cane clicking in a measured rhythm across the frozen ground. He had slept little the night before, his mind turning over the details of what was to come. In the privacy of his thoughts, he had imagined every possible outcome, from finding nothing but hardened wood to uncovering a treasure of such significance it would alter the university's history. He did not allow himself to linger too long on either possibility. It was enough to know that today, after decades of wondering, the truth would at last be within reach. Gradually, the courtyard began to fill. The arborist from the committee stood near the base of the tree, conferring with two tree surgeons whose equipment gleamed in the morning light. Long-handled saws with finely sharpened blades, chisels, clamps, and protective wraps. Nearby, a conservator from the university museum unpacked padded cases lined with soft fabric, ready to receive whatever might be extracted. A cameraman set up a tripod to document the proceedings, and a few administrators lingered at the edge of the growing crowd, speaking in low tones. Even a scattering of students had gathered, drawn by the murmurs that something unusual was about to happen. Blake kept to one side, his eyes never leaving the bulge. In the stillness before the first cut, he felt the presence of time pressing in from all sides, as if the decades between the tree's planting and this moment had folded in on themselves. When the arborist finally gave a short nod to his team, the air seemed to tighten. The first saw blade bit into the outer bark with a slow, deliberate motion. The sound was muted, a dry rasp like paper being torn, and the scent of fresh wood rose almost immediately, sweet, sharp, and strangely clean. The surgeons worked with care, peeling away the outer layers of bark in thin, curling strips. Each removed section revealed deeper tones of the wood, from weathered gray to a warm, golden brown. The bulge, so long an object of speculation, began to change shape under their tools, the rounded swell giving way to subtle contours hidden beneath. Blake leaned forward slightly, gripping his cane. He could see the crowd shifting, murmurs running through them like a current, but his focus remained fixed on the widening cut. Half an hour passed in measured effort. The work slowed as the team encountered denser growth, wood that had clearly been under pressure for years. Then, without warning, a glint caught the light deep within the cut. It was faint, no more than a suggestion of something smoother than the surrounding wood, but Blake saw it instantly and felt his pulse quicken. The arborist paused, motioning for the others to stop. The conservator stepped closer, peering into the narrow opening. The glint came again, unmistakably metallic this time, and a ripple of excitement ran through the onlookers. The next stage required finer tools. The saws were set aside in favor of chisels and small mallets, each tap deliberate, each movement calculated to avoid damage. The sound of metal on wood was a steady, almost ceremonial rhythm. As the opening widened, more of the hidden surface emerged, a curve of dull bronze, mottled with the green of aged patina. The air seemed to grow heavier, the murmurs of the crowd fading into an expectant hush. Blake moved closer, his eyes scanning every new inch of revealed metal. The surface was marked with faint engravings, the lines softened by time, but still discernible. He thought he could make out the crest of the university, though it was partially obscured by the remaining wood. The realization sent a tremor through him. This was no accident, no random intrusion into the tree's growth. It had been placed here deliberately, positioned in such a way that the tree would embrace it completely. The final layers of wood gave way with a slow, splintering sound. At last, the object was freed from its living sheath, though it still rested snugly in the cavity that had formed around it. The conservator reached in with gloved hands, cradling the cylinder as it was lifted into the open air for the first time in what might have been nearly 2 centuries. The bronze gleamed dully in the winter sunlight, its surface etched with patterns that caught the light in intricate, almost hypnotic ways. Gasps rose from the small crowd, followed by the staccato clicking of the cameraman's shutter. For Blake, the moment was almost disorienting. He had imagined this scene in so many variations over the years, yet the reality of it, the weight of the cylinder in sight, the mingled scents of wood and cold metal, the collective breath of the onlookers, was something entirely its own. He stepped forward as the conservator placed the artifact in one of the padded cases, his eyes tracing the engraved lines that curved around its surface. There was Latin, worn but legible, and a series of symbols he recognized from old sketches in the archives. The arborist spoke quietly with the administrators, confirming that the removal had caused no irreparable harm to the tree. The cavity would be treated and sealed to prevent disease, and the rest of the trunk appeared sound. Already, a sense of relief was spreading through those who had feared the tree might be lost. For Blake, however, the focus had shifted entirely. His attention was fixed on the cylinder, now secured and ready to be taken to a controlled environment for examination. He knew this was only the beginning. Whatever lay inside would tell the true story of why it had been hidden, and by whom. As the crowd began to disperse, Blake lingered near the plane tree. He reached out and placed a hand gently on the bark just above the cavity, feeling the rough, cool surface beneath his palm. In that touch, he imagined a silent acknowledgement from the living guardian that had held this secret through generations of storms, seasons, and human change. The tree had done its part. Now it was his turn to ensure that the secret was not squandered. The conservator approached with the case, giving him a brief nod before heading toward the museum building where the next phase awaited. Blake turned to follow, his cane striking the cobblestones with renewed purpose. The day of revelation had arrived, but its true weight would only be measured in what came next. And in the quiet between each step, he felt the echo of the past drawing closer, ready to speak at last. The conservator moved briskly across the courtyard, the padded case held with both hands as though it contained something as fragile as glass. Blake followed a few steps behind, his gaze fixed on the dull gleam of the bronze cylinder through the narrow gap in the case's lid. The air was sharp with winter, and each step toward the museum seemed to ring louder than the last, echoing off the brick walls as if marking the cadence of a slow procession. The small group, 2 administrators, the conservator, the arborist, and Blake, passed under the archway that led to the museum's side entrance, away from the main public halls. This was the quiet part of the building, reserved for conservation and research, a place where the weight of history was measured not in grand displays, but in meticulous examination. The room, prepared for the capsule's opening, was lit by tall windows on one side and a row of shaded lamps over the workbench where the case was set down. The air smelled faintly of linen and the chemical tang of preservation materials. On the far wall, cabinets of varying heights stood closed, each labeled in neat handwriting: archives, tools, protective wraps, acid-free paper. A large table occupied the center of the room, its surface covered in a pale felt that would prevent the artifact from rolling or scratching. Blake removed his gloves and coat, but kept his scarf, the room being cool by design to protect sensitive materials. He positioned himself at the right-hand corner of the table, giving the conservator space to work, but close enough to see every detail. When the case was opened, the cylinder seemed almost to absorb the light rather than reflect it. Its bronze surface was darkened by centuries, streaked here and there with the green bloom of verdigris. Along one side, the faint outline of the university crest emerged, a shield flanked by two stylized branches, beneath which ran a motto in Latin. The letters were shallow but sharp enough to read, Scientia et Integritas, knowledge and integrity. Beneath this, a series of geometric engravings spiraled toward one end of the cylinder, intricate patterns whose meaning was not immediately clear. The conservator examined it with a magnifying glass, her fingers moving lightly over the surface. She pointed out a seam near the midpoint, almost imperceptible, where the metal appeared to have been fused or locked. "It's a seal," she murmured. "Whoever made this didn't want it opened casually." Blake leaned in, noting the tiny scoring marks around the seam, deliberate, methodical, as if the craftsman had known the tree would one day apply pressure and needed the design to withstand centuries of slow, living compression. Specialized tools were brought out. Thin-bladed instruments, soft wedges, a narrow clamp designed to grip without scratching. The process was painstaking, every movement measured against the possibility of damaging the contents. As the conservator worked, Blake found himself studying the object not as an artifact alone, but as a message. It had been placed in the tree deliberately, with patience and intent, perhaps with the understanding that it might never be found in the maker's lifetime. What knowledge had they thought too dangerous or too precious to leave unguarded? At last, after nearly an hour of careful manipulation, a soft metallic click sounded. The seam widened fractionally, and the scent of aged metal and something else, dry, faintly organic, escaped into the cool air. The conservator eased the two halves apart, revealing a snugly fitted inner lining of darkened wood. Within this lining, wrapped in layers of faded silk, were three distinct bundles. Each was tied with narrow bands of leather, brittle with age but still intact. The first bundle, when unwrapped, revealed a series of parchment scrolls. The ink was still remarkably legible, though the edges of the parchment had darkened. Blake recognized the script immediately. Latin, interspersed with sketches and fine, precise lines. There were diagrams of mechanical devices, wheels, gears, what looked like an early form of a rotary engine, accompanied by meticulous notes on their function. The designs were unlike anything that had been built in the 1830s. They bore concepts that would not be widely understood until decades later. As Blake traced a finger near, but not on, the edge of the parchment, he felt the magnitude of what he was seeing. The second bundle contained a smaller leather-bound book, its cover worn smooth. Opening it revealed a collection of essays, all in the same careful handwriting, addressing topics as varied as the transmission of electrical currents, the medical use of certain plant compounds, and the principles of pressurized steam. Each entry began with a date and a short paragraph explaining why the knowledge had been withheld. In several places, the author wrote of the climate of the age and the necessity of guardianship until such a time as man's wisdom shall match his reach. The words carried not just a sense of innovation, but of profound caution, as if the writer feared not only misuse, but also the consequences of premature understanding. It was the third bundle that drew the most collective breath from the room. Unwrapping the silk revealed a small mechanical object, no larger than a man's hand, yet composed of an intricate network of interlocking parts. It resembled a clock in the way its gears meshed, but its central mechanism was unfamiliar. A set of coiled springs housed within a circular frame connected to a series of minute levers. It was crafted from brass and steel, with a finish so fine that even after years hidden in the heart of a tree, the metal retained a muted glow. The conservator turned it gently, revealing markings on the underside, again in Latin, indicating that this was a demonstration model meant to prove a concept. Blake could not take his eyes from it. He had read about such devices in passing references, always dismissed by mainstream historians as fanciful or apocryphal. But here it was, real and tangible, resting on a felt-covered table under the watchful eyes of the university. It was not simply an invention. It was evidence of a mind far ahead of its time, someone who had reached forward into the future and drawn back an idea that the world would not be ready for until much later. The administrators exchanged quiet glances, the weight of the discovery beginning to settle on them. The implications were vast, not only for the history of the university, but for the story of human innovation. There would be questions of ownership, of publication, of how much should be revealed and when. But for Blake, in that moment, none of those concerns outweighed the simple, unshakable truth. The vessel had been real, and it had held exactly what he had suspected all along, knowledge deliberately hidden, waiting for the right eyes to find it. He felt a curious sense of connection to the unknown hands that had sealed this capsule so long ago. They had trusted that the living tree would protect it, that one day someone would come who could understand and safeguard its contents. Blake could not yet know how fierce the battles ahead would be, political, academic, even personal, but he knew without question that the burden of that trust now rested with him. As the conservator rewrapped each item in protective material and placed them in new archival cases, Blake stood a little apart, his mind already turning toward the challenges that would come with dawn. When the cases were closed and secured, the room felt different, as if the past had taken a deep breath and stepped into the present. Blake glanced once toward the window where the bare branches of the plane tree were just visible, silhouetted against the pale afternoon sky. It stood there as it had for generations, stripped of its hidden burden, yet still dignified, a silent witness to the knowledge it had cradled. The professor allowed himself a single, quiet thought before following the others out. The guardianship of the tree had ended, but his own had just begun. By the following morning, the news had already spread far beyond the walls of the university. What had begun as quiet whispers in the quadrangle the day before had found its way into faculty lounges, student cafes, and eventually the inboxes of people with no direct connection to the institution. A few lines, stripped of detail but rich in suggestion, had appeared on a local news site overnight. Ancient artifact found inside university landmark tree. By mid-morning, the article had been reposted dozens of times, each repetition shedding a little more discretion and gaining a little more speculation. Words like treasure, invention, and secret technology appeared in headlines, accompanied by photographs of the plane tree and its newly revealed cavity, a dark, silent aperture in the winter light. For Professor Blake, the shift in atmosphere was immediate and palpable. Where the previous day's work had been carried out in a small, controlled group, today the museum's conservation wing felt like the center of a storm. There were unexpected visitors, officials from the university's legal department, 2 members of the Board of Governors, even a journalist who had somehow managed to slip past security before being politely escorted out. Administrators moved in pairs down the hallways, their voices low and their expressions unreadable. It was clear to Blake that the question of what had been found was no longer purely academic. It had become a matter of ownership, influence, and perhaps even profit. In the late morning, a formal meeting was called in the Vice-Chancellor's private conference room. The setting was a world apart from the dim, studious quiet of the museum, a bright space with polished floors, modern furniture, and large windows overlooking the quadrangle. Blake took a seat near one end of the long table, the capsule's 3 archival cases resting on a separate side table, guarded by a museum staff member. Around him, the attendees gathered. The Vice-Chancellor herself, 2 governors, the head of the history faculty, the university's chief legal officer, and a representative from the development office. The Vice-Chancellor began in a tone that was courteous but edged with authority. She acknowledged the remarkable significance of the find and commended those present at its discovery for their care and diligence. But then, as if turning a page, her language shifted. The discovery, she said, raised serious questions about how the artifact and its contents should be handled. There would need to be a review of legal precedent regarding objects found on university property, particularly those embedded in structures or natural landmarks. There would need to be consultation with the board about possible exhibitions, publications, and, if deemed in the university's best interest, the sale or licensing of the material to outside institutions. It was at that word, sale, that Blake felt the first stirrings of unease rise into something sharper. He waited until the Vice-Chancellor had finished outlining her points before leaning forward, his hands clasped before him on the table. With the patience of a man accustomed to winning arguments slowly, he reminded the room that the contents of the capsule were not simply artifacts but repositories of knowledge that had been deliberately hidden and safeguarded for nearly 2 centuries. The documents, the designs, even the mechanical device itself were not trinkets to be auctioned but legacies of intellectual courage, meant to be preserved in the spirit in which they had been entrusted to the tree. One of the governors, a tall man with an easy smile that did not quite reach his eyes, countered smoothly. He suggested that the value of the find extended beyond history, that it might attract funding, donors, and partnerships from corporations eager to associate themselves with groundbreaking discoveries. Such partnerships, he argued, could bring millions into the university's coffers, funding scholarships, research programs, and infrastructure projects for decades to come. He was careful to frame his point as one of maximizing benefit for the institution, but Blake heard the undertone clearly enough. The head of the history faculty spoke next, voicing cautious agreement with Blake. She argued that immediate monetization risked stripping the find of its scholarly integrity. Once it was in private hands, there would be no guarantee that the public, or even the academic community, would ever see the complete contents. The Vice-Chancellor listened, nodding occasionally, but her expression remained inscrutable. Blake realized that this was not going to be a matter settled in one meeting. The forces at play here were too many and too varied. The pull of prestige, the temptation of financial windfalls, the genuine desire to advance knowledge, and, in some quarters, the simple instinct to control what others could not. He also understood that he was stepping into a role he had not asked for, but could not refuse, that of the capsule's unofficial guardian. In the days that followed, the battle unfolded in quiet but relentless moves. Blake found himself attending meeting after meeting, drafting careful statements and reaching out to allies among the faculty who valued preservation over profit. At the same time, he became aware of a different kind of pressure, subtle at first, then more overt. One afternoon, an envelope was slipped under his office door. Inside was a letter from an anonymous sender, warning him that too much resistance could jeopardize his standing at the university. Another time, a man he did not recognize approached him on the street outside the campus gates, introducing himself as a representative of a private foundation and offering what could only be described as a bribe in exchange for influence over the capsule's fate. Blake refused, of course, but the encounter left him with a bitter taste. Despite these pressures, he remained steady. The mechanical device from the capsule became his strongest argument. In meetings, he would point to it and ask, "If this is what they were willing to hide, what does it say about their vision? Do you believe they meant for it to be dismantled and sold piecemeal?" His words struck a chord with some, though others responded with platitudes about balancing ideals with practicality. The tension reached its peak at a special session of the University Council convened to decide the capsule's future. The council chamber was filled to capacity, with faculty, students, and press gathered in the galleries above. Blake spoke plainly, without theatrics, of the trust placed in them by those who had sealed the vessel in the tree. He spoke of the responsibility to honor that trust, not to exploit it. He did not deny the potential for the discovery to benefit the university, but he argued for a benefit measured in knowledge shared freely, in exhibits open to the public, in research that would expand the boundaries of understanding rather than the balance of a financial ledger. When the vote was taken, the decision was not unanimous, but it was clear enough. The capsule and its contents would remain the property of the university, to be preserved in perpetuity as part of its historical collection. The materials would be housed in a secure, climate-controlled archive, accessible to scholars and the public alike under carefully managed conditions. There would be exhibitions, but no sale. No transfer to private hands. Blake left the council chamber that day knowing the battle was won, but also that it had changed him. He had been a scholar his entire life, content to sift through the dust of the past, piecing together the stories of others. Now he had become part of one, a story of guardianship, of resisting the easier path in favor of the harder, better one. And though he knew the debates would not truly end, he felt a quiet satisfaction as he crossed the quadrangle and glanced towards the plane tree. It stood lighter now, freed of its hidden burden, but no less a sentinel. Its centuries of watchfulness had passed to him, and he intended to honor them. The weeks that followed the council's decision passed in a rhythm of careful order, as if the university itself had exhaled and returned to a steadier pulse. The storm of outside interest that had swirled so fiercely around the discovery began to thin, though not entirely disappear. Articles still appeared now and then, and inquiries still reached the vice-chancellor's office from curious collectors or speculative journalists, but they were met with the same calm, definitive reply. The capsule and its contents were to remain in the custody of the university. Inside the campus, life resumed its familiar cadence. Students hurried between lectures, professors filled the lecture halls, and the winter term settled into the slow progression toward spring. Yet, beneath the everyday routines, something had shifted. There was now a tangible awareness that the institution was custodian to something extraordinary. For Professor Blake, the conclusion of the battle brought not relief in the usual sense, but a deep, resonant calm. He had carried the tension of those weeks like a constant weight. And now that the question of ownership was settled, he could turn to what he considered the more vital work, ensuring that the contents of the capsule would be studied, understood, and preserved in the spirit intended by those who had hidden them. He spent long hours in the newly prepared archive where the items were stored, a climate-controlled room beneath the museum, lined with shelves of acid-free boxes and drawers sealed against dust and light. The three main objects from the capsule, the parchment scrolls, the leather-bound book, and the mechanical device, were each housed in their own custom cases, resting on padded mounts like honored guests. There was a quiet satisfaction in knowing they were safe, but also an awareness that their meaning would grow only through the patient work of scholarship. Blake began assembling a small team of trusted researchers, each chosen for both expertise and discretion. Together, they began the meticulous process of translating, cataloging, and cross-referencing the documents. The Latin text yielded slowly under their combined attention, revealing not only technical descriptions but also fragments of personal reflection from the author, thoughts on the moral weight of discovery, notes on the political climate of the 1830s, and even small sketches of the campus as it had been then. The more Blake read, the more he felt a strange kinship with the long-dead mind that had shaped these pages. The mechanical device proved equally compelling. Engineers and historians of technology visited under controlled conditions, their examinations revealing that the object incorporated principles not widely understood until decades after its likely construction. Though its precise purpose remained a matter of debate, all agreed it was a prototype of unusual sophistication, a tangible example of how far ahead the creator's vision had been. Each new insight only deepened Blake's sense that this was no mere curiosity from the past, but a deliberate act of preservation, an attempt to protect knowledge from a world not yet ready to use it wisely. As Winter's grip began to loosen, the Vice-Chancellor approached Blake with a proposal. The Council had agreed that the discovery should be commemorated, not only in the archives but visibly as part of the university's living heritage. A new plaque would be placed at the base of the plane tree, recounting its role as the guardian of the capsule. The wording would be careful, no mention of specific technical details, but a clear acknowledgement of the tree's symbolic place in the story. Blake agreed, on the condition that the text honor both the tree and the unknown individuals who had entrusted it with their secret. He was asked to draft the inscription himself, and he did so with deliberate care, choosing each word as though it were a line in a historical record. On the morning the plaque was installed, the quadrangle was bright with early spring sunlight. A small gathering of faculty, students, and staff stood beneath the plane tree's broad branches, their faces turned towards the fresh bronze fixed to the ground at the tree's base. The plaque bore a simple dedication. For nearly 2 centuries, this tree guarded a legacy entrusted to the hands of nature. May its example remind us that knowledge, like life, thrives best when protected with integrity and shared with wisdom. Blake stood among them, listening to the quiet murmur of approval, feeling the cool breeze stir the branches overhead. In the days that followed, he noticed a change in how people moved through the courtyard. Students would slow as they passed the tree, some pausing to read the plaque, others running their hands lightly along the bark as if to feel the echo of what had been hidden there. It became a point of quiet reflection, a place where history felt close enough to touch. The legend of the plane tree had always been part of the university's lore, but now it was anchored in fact and in a truth that carried with it both pride and responsibility. One evening, long after the campus had emptied of its daily bustle, Blake found himself standing alone beneath the plane tree. The last light of the day lingered in the upper branches, and the air held the faint scent of new leaves. He traced his fingertips lightly over the bark near the cavity that had once held the capsule, now carefully sealed and protected. It was no longer the mystery that had drawn his attention so many years ago, but a symbol of what could be accomplished when patience met purpose, and when the guardianship of the past was honored over the convenience of the present. In that quiet moment, he thought of the unknown figures who had stood here nearly 200 years earlier, placing the capsule in the hands of a young tree. They could not have known his name, but he felt certain they had imagined someone like him, a custodian who would understand not just the value of the knowledge, but the importance of how it was kept. The burden they had left was not light, but it was one he accepted freely. As he turned to leave, the lamps along the quadrangle flickered on, casting warm pools of light across the cobblestones. The plane tree stood dark and steady against the deepening sky, its silhouette as familiar as the university's oldest buildings. And Blake knew, with a certainty that needed no words, that while the tree's watch had ended, its lesson would endure, rooted in the ground beneath his feet and in the minds of those who would come after, long after his own time had passed. If you enjoyed this story, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss the next one. Check out our other videos for more captivating stories, and share this video with your friends so they can experience it too.